We have a little bit of a word from John. You may remember John Humphreys from very early in the telecast, and he's also been one of the hosts up in Sydney. And John, what have you got for us?
Just a quick announcement. Long-time attendees at the Friedman conference will know that one of the regular things we do every year is we host the Liberty Awards, the Australian Libertarian of the Year, Young Libertarian of the Year, Libertarian Activist of the Year, and Lifetime Achievement Award. We are doing that again this year, so we're not doing it right now, but I'm just letting you know that the awards will start to be presented at 5 p.m. Australian time, so in 2 hours. And then at the end of each session, at the end for every hour there, from then on, we will announce a new winner over those next 4 hours. So look forward to that. Look forward to that coming up at 5 p.m. our time in 2 hours, the first winner of the awards. Brian, would you like to introduce us here?
Absolutely. I'd like to first just thank everyone for joining in. We're a third of the way through this 24-hour conference, and people seem to really be enjoying everything that's going on. And to our Melbourne crew who are pulling the 24-hour shift, thank you so much for all the support. Our first speaker is Sharon Holm. She's the Executive Director of Human Rights in China, adjunct professor of law at the New York University School of Law, and a professor of law at the City University New York School of Law as well. So Sharon, if we could take away with you and get started, that'd be fantastic.
Well, thank you so much. I am really happy that we have this chance to join the conversation, and I understand in some ways we will be opening up the aperture a bit in terms of the scope of the conversation. The topic of this panel was, I understand, the challenges of a rising China. So the first thing I want to say is that train has left the station, and that China has risen, and that the challenges are all very, very present. So I'm going to talk about 3 aspects of the challenge as a way to tee off Craig, who will focus, I understand, more on the situation in Hong Kong now post the passing of the national security law. And then I'm looking forward to hearing what Senator Patterson will do to come to our aid. So that I understand is the flow of our tee-off. So the first aspect of China's current challenge is that it's posing the greatest threat to the global world order. And the first aspect of that global threat, obviously, every country now is seeing, primarily because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the largest pandemic since the early 20th century, is that is the direct result of an authoritarian regime that is engaged in pervasive censorship, information control, and massive, comprehensive social political control. And we can see the fallout of what happens with that kind of a system. But in the morning, whatever it was, morning or afternoon of the opening of your 24 hours, is that David Friedman was talking about radical ideas. So the first challenge that China is posing is to a radical idea that appeared 75 years ago. And that radical idea, because this year is the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter. And the radical idea was that post-World War II, where we saw massive genocide of a fascist regime who had no respect for humans and made the decision that certain humans, should not be allowed to live, had the massive murder and genocide of millions of people. So the radical idea post-World War II was the creation of a multilateral global order that was going to maintain international peace and security, not by law of the jungle, but under principles of international law, principles of justice. There would be friendly relations, it would be international cooperation, and it would be a center for harmonizing actions. So since then, when China retook the Republic of China, Taiwan seat at the UN, China has progressively gone from being an aspiring good player in the global order, which is what the democratic West had hoped, that China would become part of the WTO, would be part of the UN, and hence would play by the rules and would be a good member of the international community. So instead, what we have seen since China has rejoined the UN and the international order is China went from trying to reassure the international community that it was respecting human rights, respecting rule of law, respecting the international rules, to now, let me fast forward 75 years, and where we are in the last, let's say, period, and particularly accelerating under Xi Jinping, when Xi Jinping took power 2012 and then full power in 2013, is that China has mounted a systematic, comprehensive attack on the international world order, in particular the human rights system. It has not only attacked, it has gone from attacking to now replacing. So now it's attack and replace. And it's offering alternative models. It's a model of human rights with Chinese characteristics. It is a model of not rule of law. It is a model called 依法治国, which means to rule the country by law, except that the party and the over 80 million members are not subject to the law. And the third thing is it's advocating a democratic model. That is, they usually point to the election of Trump as Exhibit A, that look what the democratic system produced. It produced Trump. And they usually point to that as a failure of the Western democratic model, hence why the Chinese so-called democratic model is supposed to be better. So where we are now, which is, if people are interested in the Q&A, we can go into more, but there is an enormous challenge of the attack on the norms, the values, the operationalization, the mechanisms, like a full attack. And China is not alone, and it's part of a group called the like-minded countries. And those like-minded countries include Russia, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, India, Pakistan, so forth. So that's the first challenge, is on the international arena. The second challenge is yesterday, July 9th, was the 5th anniversary of the crackdown in China of where over 300 lawyers, massive, all around the country, were rounded up, disappeared, detained, interrogated, and were subject to unlawful trials and torture. And so this I say that is also, the second anniversary, which then is a way for us to understand the massive domestic deterioration of rights in the mainland. And that includes the massive religious and cultural repression in Tibet and in East Turkestan, or Xinjiang, as the party state calls it, and the mass internment of millions of ethnic Uyghurs, Muslims, and Cossacks, and other groups. So this is exactly the kind of camps, concentration camps, that the whole world order that I began with was supposed to prevent from ever happening again. In addition to that, we moved to Hong Kong, and what we started seeing in Hong Kong since 2003, actually, is the increasing encroachment on Hong Kong's autonomy and the freedoms and independence and the rights, the rule of law that was promised to Hong Kong under the 1984 joint declaration between the People's Republic and the UK. Under this agreement, which Hong Kong would be, quote, returned to China, but was supposed to have its way of life preserved for 50 years. So the third challenge that I wanted to discuss is that in Hong Kong, sorry.
Yep, we might just jump in there. That's okay. Look, just on the topic of Hong Kong, that's something that's quite close to my heart.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I have 13 cats, and there was a disaster going on. Right.
That's okay.
So Hong Kong. There are 100,000 Australians living in Hong Kong. There are over 600 Australian businesses in the region. And one of the comments I was making to Senator Patterson is that the increasing deterioration of human rights on the mainland, in the region, and much broader through the One Belt One Road, through the digital Silk Road, that those practices on the mainland are spreading through these infrastructure projects as well as through all of its engagement with other countries. But what we have seen is that since 1989, the military crackdown by the People's Liberation Army on the people, where thousands of unarmed civilians were killed, and we don't know how many because the full number hasn't been out, is that after 1989, there was actually a kind of deal that was cut. And the West bought into it. And that deal was, we will have economic liberalization, but we will not have political liberalization. And the notion was that so that was the bifurcation. Within 2 months after the military crackdown, most of Western business in China and with China pretty much returned to normal. So subsequently, all of the human rights abuses that has been well documented and that is reported extensively and that the West is quite aware of, nothing happened. Nothing happened. There were no costs to those human rights abuses. And so the message that was sent to China was that we will have no fallout in continuing. Hence, despite a three-pronged crisis facing China, that is a U.S.-China trade war, a rising global pushback on COVID-19, and third, a slowing economy, which is a disaster for the regime, Beijing still bet that it could impose my third challenge, which is the passing of the national security law in Hong Kong. And this was on the eve of went into effect on June 30th at 11 p.m. On July 1st, the first day, right away, we already had several hundred people arrested, including a dozen under the new law. Why this matters, we've seen a lot of the reporting on it, is that the law creates 4 new offenses: secession, subversion, terrorist activities, and collusion with a foreign country or with external elements to endanger national security. Why does that matter for Australians sitting there discussing, domestic debate about where you want your libertarian policies to go and whether you want taxes or not, and whether you want to be left alone or not? It's this. It's that the new law purports to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction. That means sitting in Melbourne, talking to us now, that if Craig and I were found indeed to be seeking sanctions from the Australian government, or seeking the help of the Australian people, or seeking you to help us promote and spread the understanding of what's happening in Hong Kong, you would basically be covered by the Act, because the Act first covers any person in Hong Kong. And it also includes any person committing acts on a vessel or an airplane, an aircraft that is registered in Hong Kong. So therefore, if you're on a Cathay flight and you say, for example, Gong for Hong Kong, glory to Hong Kong, revolution of our times, that would put you in danger of having violated one of the provisions of the Act on a vessel. The second is Craig and I, permanent residents of Hong Kong, or a company, incorporated or not incorporated in Hong Kong, committing an offense under this law outside of Hong Kong is covered. That's Article 37. Finally, anyone outside of Hong Kong who is not a permanent resident is also specifically covered under Article 38. And that is the concern, so that officials, parliamentarians, journalists, researchers, everyone is potentially covered. And because time is short, I'm not going to go into all of the specific, provisions in terms of the problems of exercising this extraterritorial jurisdiction. But what that leaves us with is there this time round, it seems that the international community and the diplomatic sector in particular are not going about as business as usual. And what we're really seeing is a shifting of the geopolitical tectonic plates, and that governments who in the past had just simply said yes, yes, and at most issue concern statements, are not just doing that. So what we're seeing is a growing number of states led by the US and the UK, and the Australian government has also been participating in the joint statements, participating in when they've been threatened or intimidated by China. I know that your Prime Minister has said back in June, Australian government will not be intimidated by your threats. So the whole universe right now of emerging responses seems to me to be taking quite seriously the China threat. It's not only threatening over 1 billion Chinese, but it is threatening everyone in the world. So there are the lifeboat operations, which are helping Hong Kong people who are either need to leave, can leave, and that's the offering either visas, asylum, or certain kinds of longer stays, accepting people. The second is I know that Australia, the Labour Party, is also exploring Magnitsky-type sanctions, that is sanctioning offenders like party leaders, party members, and that is one of the things that's happening. Over 27 Australian parliamentarians joined a worldwide statement of parliamentarians, 904 of them. So I think there's been quite a lot of activity in Australia and in the region. And so I'm hoping that in the discussion, when Craig gives us a better sense of what the actual situation is on the ground, that we can actually segue from Senator Patterson's statement, remarks, so that we can discuss what are the things that can be done, and wherever you stand on the very interesting, complex libertarian debates that I understand your 24 hours is focusing on, wherever you stand, we do need you to stand with Hong Kong.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that talk. The issues in Hong Kong are something that are quite close to my heart. I actually went there last year to film and write about the protests that were going on. Befriended a number of protesters that I still talk to almost daily over Telegram and different channels. And unfortunately, some of them are still stuck there and they're at a loss. These are people that are former journalists. These are people that work in all walks of life. And they're trying to find ways to basically protect themselves because these national security laws are a bit of a hammer blow. So with that in mind, I'm going to throw across to Craig. Now, Craig is a former convener of the Progressive Lawyers Group over in Hong Kong. Craig, thank you so much for joining us. We're well aware of what time it is over stateside for you as well, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah. Good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm going to talk about the situation in Hong Kong today. And first, I will talk about the general public reaction to the national security law. I basically will summarize that the reaction is that people are rather confused and also rather furious about that, because a lot of people in Hong Kong, we do not understand the law very well, because the law is actually passed by China and is not passed by the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. And as you may know, that Hong Kong is adopting the common law system, while the Chinese law, they're having their own civil law system, which is quite different from Hong Kong. So a lot of lawyers trying to interpret the law and try to explain to the general public about the law. But I have to say that one thing about the Hong Kong lawyer is that we're trained under the common law system. We actually lack of the ability to fully understand the meaning or definition behind the Chinese law. And it is very important, especially like Chinese law expert Sharon, and to give us some explanation and some guidelines of how to understand this law. And apart from that, in Hong Kong, the general public also found that there are a very small amount or small bunch of people, they're actually supporting the national security law, but it must not be as many as the government claim. And as we can see from the public opinion poll in Hong Kong, there are more than 60% of Hong Kong people, they are against the law. And even though there's quite a lot of people are still protesting and still fighting for the causes, there there are also a small bunch of Hong Kong people. They are actually looking to leave Hong Kong because they see that the promises under the joint declarations been already broken, and so they do not feel like they're safe to fight against the CCP in Hong Kong anymore. However, and from the protester point of view, we can see that after the law passed in Hong Kong, protesters are being very creative in different ways to protest. And the government issued this press statement saying that the liberating Hong Kong revolution of our time is actually probably violating the national security law. And the protesters in Hong Kong, they have a very creative way to protest now. For example, like they're holding up the blank paper and then actually meaning nothing, but then the police still try to harass them or arrest them. And apart from that, people are saying that the Hong Kong anthem, "Glory to Hong Kong," is also violating the national security law because some government officials saying that it's actually advocating the independence of Hong Kong. That's why it's in breach of the national security law. So there are some people that instead of saying the lyrics, they're saying the numbers to replace the lyrics, but using the same tool. And so at the same time, so that they can convey the spirit of the protest. And as to the civil society, we can see that, and the political organization, we can see that a lot of these prominent human rights activists or the politicians, they're trying to disassociate themselves with their own organization because they actually see the risk of the national security law that they may also endanger the existence of their organizations. And one more thing quite interesting, what is happening now at this moment in Hong Kong is that we are having these primary election among the pro-democracy camp so that we can select the candidates to run for the election in September. And what happened last night was that the police actually raided this office of the organizer and seized their computer. And of course, the police are saying that it was just a coincidence, but everybody can see that there must be a political agenda behind that to hinder these primaries. So you can see that not only the police, the privacy watchdog in Hong Kong also issue a statement saying that using the personal data from the election website that will also be contravening the election law as well. So we can see that the oppression from Hong Kong is not just from the police officers, but also from different branches of the government departments as well. And finally, I would like to talk about the reaction of the business. And as you may see from the news that some big tech company, for example, like Facebook, WhatsApp, they are actually denying the Hong Kong government from getting personal information from them. And we can also see from a smaller business in Hong Kong, we have this pro-democracy yellow economy circle. And a lot of these restaurants and small businesses, they are withdrawing from this circle because they are afraid that joining this circle would be in breach of the national security law as well. They also these restaurants or these shops usually have a lot of declaration to support democracy in Hong Kong. They also take down all these declarations in Hong Kong as well. And just what happened this morning, it was reported that there's a magazine for the young people, and they also stopped the issuance of the current issue because they believe that some content actually may also be violating the national security law. So you can see that the national security law not only impacting the general public, the protesters, the political groups, but also impacting the business, not only the international business, but also the local businesses as well. But one thing we can be quite sure about that is Hong Kong people finding different ways to protest, to fight for our freedom and defend our rights. And we hope that China will still uphold their promises under the joint declaration. I believe the protests will still go on, and maybe at this moment, people are still adjusting what kind of tactics they should deal with this national security law. But I can actually quite confident to say that Hong Kong people not giving up, and we are going to fight for our own future and democracy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Just on your final point, I can attest to the fact that Cantonese people do not ever give up. Every single protester I talk to talks about how they're always going to keep on fighting and, be water, as the protesters like to say. You spoke about some of those changes that have been happening. To put it into context for a lot of viewers, when I was there 12 months ago, I went to a student protest and there were school students as young as 10 singing Glory to Hong Kong. On the back of that, education departments were instructed to try and get records of people that went to protest as opposed to going to school. Now there are schools that essentially, if they allow that to happen, and there's children singing these songs, they could fall afoul of these national security laws. So, we're talking about not even just adults here. It's really important. With that in mind, I'm going to throw across to Senator James Patterson. Senator Patterson's been a long-time supporter of the Friedman Conference as well as of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. But more importantly, he's been a big fighter for liberal democratic values, a big supporter for freedom in Hong Kong, and was an integral figure in some of the pushback against the CCP's crackdown on Hong Kong, along with Andrew Hastie and Tim Wilson. So, Senator Patterson, thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to cut across to you now.
Brian, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm particularly honoured to be here with Craig and Sharon for all the amazing work they've done standing up for the people of Hong Kong, standing alongside the people of Hong Kong in their very righteous fight against the Chinese Communist Party. The topic for my discussion today is Australia's changing relationship with China, and in many ways we have been a canary in the coal mine. Our relationship has changed the fastest and the earliest with China, but we're not alone in that. And sometimes in the myopic domestic political debates that we have, we forget that many other countries are experiencing the same things we are with China. In my view, Australia's relationship with China peaked, if you want to call it that, 5 years ago with the signing of the free trade agreement between Australia and China. And pretty much it's been all downhill since that time. It's been 5 years of maybe not linear downward spiral, but certainly a downward spiral. And today, where we stand, I think we're at the worst point in our relationship with China. But I strongly suspect we have further to fall yet before it's rectified. It's remarkable in some ways that it has been Australia that's changed the first and the fastest on China, because of Western countries, we are the most exposed to China. Not only is China in our backyard, but there is no Western country that is more exposed and therefore in some ways more dependent on China than Australia is in a trade sense. Over a third of our exports go to China, and we also import a vast array of very critical inputs to industry, science and medicine and our economy from China that we can't or haven't been able to source from elsewhere. So we are uniquely exposed. But in many ways, we've led the charge in standing up to the Chinese Communist Party and refashioning a better and more healthy relationship on a more equal footing with the Chinese Communist Party. And particularly we're now seeing in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, many other countries that had been lagging behind Australia catching up to where we were and waking up to where we've been in the realisations we've come to on the CCP. I want to illustrate Australia's changing relationship with China through the prism of 3 extradition treaties. There was an extradition treaty proposed between Australia and the People's Republic of China. There was, of course, the Hong Kong PRC extradition treaty. And then finally, there's Australia's extradition treaty with Hong Kong. And over a series of time, they have really charted that changing relationship. Back in March 2017, a long dormant, negotiated but never ratified extradition treaty between Australia and China was brought to the fore by the then Turnbull government and Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. Now, this is an agreement that was negotiated under John Howard in 2007, but he never sought to ratify it, nor did his successors as Prime Minister, including Kevin Rudd, Julie Gillard and Tony Abbott. But under Malcolm Turnbull and Julie Bishop, they did seek to ratify this agreement. There are a lot of good reasons why no Prime Minister previously had tried to ratify it. The 99.9% conviction rate in the Chinese legal system being just one. But of course, even the threat of extradition for someone in the Chinese-Australian diaspora would be a very powerful tool in the hands of the United Front Work Department to use to intimidate the Chinese diaspora into supporting Beijing's political objectives. So myself, along with a small number of other backbenchers, including Andrew Hastie and Tim Wilson that Brian mentioned, were surprised that this was even on the agenda. We couldn't contemplate the idea that any Australian or other citizen under our care could be extradited or have the threat of extradition to China because our government was going to agree to an agreement with China. So we threatened, if need be, to cross the floor in the Parliament, in the Senate, to defeat this proposed agreement. It was one of the toughest things any of us have done in politics. At that point, each of us had been in Parliament for only about 12 months. We were young, new backbenchers, and we were standing up against our own Prime Minister, our own Foreign Minister, our own government. But thankfully, because of our threats and because the Labor Party and other parties in the Parliament subsequently also came to the same view that we did and said they would oppose the extradition treaty, the government withdrew it. And Australia has never ratified an extradition treaty with the People's Republic of China, and I don't believe we ever will. But we did come very close, and had we not taken the stand that we did, I suspect that agreement would have sailed through and Australia would have had an extradition treaty with China. Just 2 years later, in June 2019, when Hong Kong had been through its debate about whether it should have an extradition treaty with China, and when it was announced that it was going to be withdrawn, it was not going to be progressed, our new Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, under our new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, issued a media release congratulating the government of Hong Kong for cancelling this extradition treaty. So in just a 2-year period, we had gone from trying to have our own extradition treaty with the People's Republic of China to congratulating other countries when they ceased having an extradition treaty with China. That in itself was huge progress. But it was really reaffirmed only this week when the Morrison government and, again, Foreign Minister Marise Payne cancelled Australia's existing extradition treaty with Hong Kong, that full circle has really come. Because this time, while people like myself and Tim Wilson, Andrew Hastie certainly were advocating within government that we cancel this extradition treaty, following the passage of the national security law, we thought being extradited to Hong Kong for any Australian or any other citizen under our care was effectively the same thing as being extradited to the PRC. Even though we were pushing for it, we were pushing this time on an open door. We had a receptive audience. We had a Prime Minister and a Foreign Minister who immediately agreed that this was the right thing to do. And without any threats, without any need to cross the floor, they stood up this week and announced that we were cancelling that extradition treaty. That's an enormous amount of progress in just 3 years in Australia's domestic politics. And there are many things that have contributed to that. There's the domestic political scandals around Sam Dastyari and foreign interference. There is the changing nature of China itself and the global events that have led to that. And Australia's domestic policy settings have changed a lot in that time. We've passed foreign interference legislation to guard against attempts to interfere in our politics. We banned Huawei from participating in the 5G rollout here in Australia. But the truth is that there's no way that Australia could have ignored the events. We've spoken already about Hong Kong. That has been at the front of minds of many Australians because it's such a familiar place for so many Australians. But Australians are appalled at every new revelation that comes out about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Every time they hear about the persecuted Christian church in the PRC. Every time they hear about the sabre rattling towards the free people of Taiwan. Every time they hear another story about the oppression in Tibet. Every time they hear about the expansion of China into the South China Sea against all international law, norms and all international laws, it was becoming impossible for anyone to ignore. Now, there is a debate in Chinese scholar circles about whether Xi Jinping is just a continuation from his predecessors or whether he marks a new shift. For our purposes, that doesn't really matter. At the very least, we can all agree that under Xi Jinping, the PRC has become much more overt in its approach to the world and much more aggressive in its approach to the world. And it's so important that we realise that it's not just Australia that's experiencing this, but everyone's experiencing this. It's Sweden, it's Norway, it's the United Kingdom, it's Germany, it's Japan, it's Vietnam, it's the Philippines, it's Malaysia, it's everyone. There is not a country in the world that has diplomatic relations with China that's not having trouble in those diplomatic relations. The good news is, though, that the world is pushing back, the world is standing up, and Australia's played a leadership role in that. When Andrew Hastie and I were banned from visiting China last year, we received across-the-board bipartisan support in Australia. And that's not something that happens very often in our politics, just like it doesn't happen very often in American politics. But on the question of China, there's strong bipartisan support in Washington, D.C., in London and in Canberra for a tougher approach. We've formed a group in the Australian Parliament called the Wolverines. It's a tongue-in-cheek bipartisan group that is dedicated to standing up against China and defending our national interests and our sovereignty and our values. And effectively, the Wolverines have now gone global with a new organisation called the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, which has 16 member countries plus the European Union. And in each of those countries, there is a co-chair from each side of politics. It is a bipartisan issue now in so many other countries and so many people are joining us. That's a really welcome and important thing, but it's only the start. This is going to have to continue. And if the world is to secure freedom for the people of Hong Kong, or for anyone else, for the people of Taiwan, for the people of Australia, for the people of anywhere in the world, we're going to have to work together. We're going to have to stand up, and we're going to have to be very assertive. And that's something I'm dedicated to doing for as long as I have an opportunity to do so. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Senator Patterson. Just on the government's response, it was a big step in the right direction. And I can say that amongst a lot of the protesters I've spoken to, they were happy to see Australia sort of push back a bit. But just on that, some of the key points seem to be we're making it easier for Hong Kong businesses to set up in Australia, and we're making it easier for Hong Kong residents in Australia to extend their visas and have a pathway to permanent residency. But previously we spoke about students who face punishment for singing a song in China. In Hong Kong, protesters that could face extradition, and God knows what would happen if they were taken to mainland China. What is the government doing to help those people specifically in Hong Kong that are trying to get out now? Opening businesses is fantastic, and what's happening is a great step in the right direction. But what's happening beyond that? Is there anything else that's on the cards, or is there anything you can elaborate?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It's a good question. It's a fair question. I would characterise the announcement this week as a good start.
Yes.
It's vitally important that the 10,000 Hong Kongers who are in Australia, most of whom I suspect do not want to return, are not forced to return, and they won't have to under this announcement. They're going to get a 5-year extension to their existing visas, which provides them a pathway to not only permanent residency but ultimately citizenship. And if they don't want to go home, they should not have to go home, and they won't. Secondly, as I said, we cancelled the extradition treaty, so no one's going to be sent to Hong Kong under spurious grounds. Very important. Thirdly, we are looking both on humanitarian grounds, but also in Australia's national interest, to welcome as many talented Hong Kongers as possible. We're making it easier for skilled people in Hong Kong to apply and be granted permanent residency here in Australia. And we're aggressively targeting businesses in Hong Kong, many of whom will be making the decision that now's the time to leave, now's not the time to stay. Now, I say that's a good start because I think there's going to be pressure for even more than that. I think the British government has done an outstanding job in leading the world on this, opening the door to 3 million British nationals overseas and their descendants. But of course, there are people in Hong Kong who are don't qualify for that status, who may also want to leave. And it won't just be Australia, but it'll be Taiwan and New Zealand and Canada, the United States. There'll be many other countries in the world that will have to step up and provide opportunities for those people, should they want to leave in the numbers that I suspect they will, if this goes in the direction that we all fear that it will.
Absolutely. And then this is another question.
Can I jump in on what I just wanted to follow up a couple of things that Senator Patterson was saying. I think it's very important that all of the Western countries are working together to offer this kind of, but Hong Kong only has a little bit over 7 million people. If 3 million go to the UK, and then you take in another whatever. So I think it is important to help those who are either abroad and don't want to go back now, but I also think we must not abandon Hong Kong to an authoritarian regime. And so the other part of the thinking is, what can we do to protect people who either cannot leave, or, and Craig and I know many of these, who are choosing not to leave because they feel, for very deep reasons of the heart and the spirit and the politics and our connection to the place, that they're going to stay to the last breath as long as they can to do what is possible. And I do feel we owe them, not just to save in lifeboats. There are those who are going to say, thank you, yes, my friend can go, you can go, I'm staying for this fight. So one of the things that I think needs, that many of the civil society groups outside that we're working in coalitions with, is that we are pushing for, and we need the governments together, we need the Western governments to push, that we either want the Secretary General to appoint a special envoy to China, and that means Tibet, Xinjiang, to go to those regions, mainland and Hong Kong, So the special envoy is very important because that needs to be pushed. The second is related to that is to have a special mission to China. And that needs to happen. The LegCo elections in September, I really think all the parliamentarians that care deeply about the electoral process and should really be sending observer missions. However, the primary, the pan-democratic primary that's being held now and tomorrow that Craig mentioned, many of the people who are running have said quite publicly when they declared their candidacy, and you should know, some of them are like 23 years old. They're saying, I have never run for office. I am going to run, and because I know I may be subjected to, just like in the district council elections, thugs jumping out of vans, attacking people with hammers and threats. And, they said, we know we might be subjected to that. But we're going to run until they literally stop us. And this primary election over the weekend is to select the pandem candidates who would run in the LegCo election in September. And I'm afraid that there is some sentiment that by September, there may not be a LegCo election because of lots of the threats and what's going on. So number one, there needs to be immediate attention to what happens this weekend on the primary elections, because there's already election interference. And secondly, there needs to be the bar associations, the parliamentarians need to be there. They need to be there as observers and to have some kind of outside monitoring. I think that needs to be done. You need to mobilize the wolverines. They need to go get those claws out and get, going. The other thing I just want to say briefly, apropos of the when you made the story about journalist friends, at a press conference this week, one of the independent journalists from Hong Kong Free Press asked this question to the chief executive. Will we be able, can you guarantee that journalists will be able to continue doing our job? And part of our job may include trying to interview people arrested, people accused of national security crimes, and we just want a guarantee that the press are going to be able to conduct our job independently. And this was the answer. I don't know, Senator Patterson, if you heard the answer. We all just were if it's possible, we were shocked. It is still possible. So the chief executive, who is authorized to pass implementing regulations for this act, this is her answer to the journalists. Well, the law is quite clear on what you are not allowed to do, which of course is not true, that the word national security is mentioned over 100 times, but there's no definition of it, which means it's going to be the mainland definition, which means we're all in trouble. So she said the law is quite clear. So if you can guarantee me 100% that you will comply with this very clear law and will not violate it, if you can promise me, I can guarantee that you can. We were like, A, that is not how law works. B, a presumption of innocence means you don't guarantee in advance that I do not, like, you have to even determine it's a crime. And the law says that it respects the presumption of innocence. And I just give you this data point. On the mainland, almost 100% conviction rate. Almost 100% conviction rate. So let's talk about like presumption of innocence, what that means, where routinely your access to counsel, your notice to your family, your disappearance is just like, so this is a very serious legalization of the police state that is on the mainland, and they're embedding it in Hong Kong because they've also created 3 levels of new implementing structures. And within the police force, there's now a special national security. Within the procuratory, there is a special division. So this is all an embedded police state. And what Craig was describing is already a white terror. And the only hope that we can hope for is that Taiwan had a period of white terror and they were able to survive it and become democratic. But the bad news is that under the law and the new implementing regulation that just came out, interpreting police powers, it targets Taiwan. So I think apropos of that, the Wolverines need to mobilize
Okay.
to support Taiwan because that's the next target. They're going for Hong Kong, and now they are absolutely threatening Taiwan. Clearly, in the law, it's named because they see Taiwan as a renegade province.
Excellent.
And because Taiwan is taking people in as well.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I had to share that.
All right, we've got an audience question here. It's talking about 10, 20 years ago, the conventional wisdom was China would be open to trade, join the WTO, get rich, and as they became more prosperous, would become more liberal, open to freedoms, open to democracy. I'm not suggesting that's happened. We're asking what went wrong with the theory? I mean, that theory seemed to hold for a lot of other countries. What did we get wrong with the theory? Is the theory wrong? Does prosperity not lead to liberalism and democracy? Or does it work for every other country except China? What's happened?
First, I'm going to leave aside the fact that it worked for every other country except China because, the whole, climate crisis that we're all going to face, an existential crisis is separate. Well, so put that aside. I think what we got wrong, not we, but many parts of the world, is that they failed to understand the DNA of an authoritarian party state, Marxist-Leninist state. And that in a Marxist-Leninist state, first, the whole purpose of the market, there never was a market in China. That since open reform in the after the Cultural Revolution, 1980s, for 30 years, it's not a market. It is not a market system. It is a state centralized where the state-owned sector, the SOEs, the national champions in the ICT sector, like Baidu, Alibaba, these are national champions, Huawei. They are these dominant players so that you don't have a free market of many, many diverse private sector actors. What you have is a state-dominated sector that grows because of the massive infusion of state investment into infrastructure and other kinds of state spending. This is not a nanny state taking care of its people. We're talking about massive investments. So I think the failure to recognize that a party state under Marxist-Leninist rule, where the purpose of law clearly articulated in the Communist Party Constitution and in the state constitution, people didn't read it and take it seriously, says that the purpose of law is to serve the party. The purpose of law is to serve the party. And you can't have economic liberalization if there's no rule of law that protects individual rights, property rights, dispute settlement, transparency in governance. You can't have economic growth that's sustainable if there's no rule of law. And the whole notion of that and you can't have a market that doesn't have the independent institutions that ensures that the market failure will not be undermined by lack of information. So if you have media completely controlled, which it is under the new regulations of the cybersecurity law, if you have information censored, how can you have markets which rely on accurate information? So I think it was built in. It was completely built in as a structural, ideological, doomed to fail. Trickle down. I may be overstating it, Senator Patterson. I see you looking at me with aura. I think you're I'm overstating it to make a point, but I'm happy to have you put a finer spin on it.
on that point, Sharon, and this will probably bring us to our next question, but I'll segue out with a key point. You sort of spoke about the role of law in mainland China is to serve the state as opposed to the people. For viewers at home, you hear about the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. It's there to serve the state as well. It is not there to serve the people. It is a direct army to serve the CCP. And on that, Senator Patterson, you brought up before some of United Front's work. Mainland China has their stability maintenance budget, which is essentially the budget they use to fund propaganda through United Front, through Confucius Institute. We've seen what's happened at different universities in Australia alone. To put that into context, their stability maintenance budget is double their defence budget. It is absolutely through the roof. So this is a question for the panel. We're trying to push for the right liberal democratic principles. We're trying to fight for the rights of Hong Kongers. We're trying to push for the right things. How do we do that at a wider scale when you have a huge nation like mainland China that is using double their defence budgets just to propagandize the rest of the world? How do you push against that?
Well, I wanted to kind of tie those two questions together if I can, Brian and John, and have a go at both at the same time. Fundamentally, I believe all people want to be free. And if there are any doubt that the Chinese people have that same aspiration that everyone else has, I think it was proven wrong in the early stages of the COVID-19 crisis, when the treatment of the whistleblower doctor, Dr. Li Wenyang, became public. And on Chinese social media platforms within the PRC, the hashtag freedom of speech was trending. The people of China had an instinctive understanding that silencing a whistleblower doctor who wants to warn his fellow citizens about the danger of human-to-human transmission of a deadly virus is a dangerous thing to do, and that freedom of speech is a much better thing to have. Now, if everybody in the world shares that aspiration, I hope that ultimately everybody gets to enjoy that. One of the things I think we were naive about with China is we hoped that technology would help support that process of opening up and freeing, but in fact, technology has been used in a very sophisticated way to enhance the power of the state and the stature of the Communist Party. Whether it's the social credit system or the DNA sequencing of the Uyghur people, this is the most sophisticated techno-authoritarian state in the world, and it uses these tools very effectively. This comes to your second question, which is tools like WeChat and TikTok and other Chinese social media services are an integral part of this process, not just within China, but in the rest of the world too. These platforms are used to propagandise on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, to censor criticism of the Chinese Communist Party, and to try and inculcate in Chinese diaspora communities all around the world the political preferences of Beijing and of the Chinese Communist Party. Western countries need to be very alert to this. Well, we shouldn't go down, in my view, the Chinese path and just create our own firewalls and prevent information coming in. But we should absolutely educate our own populations about what these platforms are. Most people think that these platforms are completely harmless. They are not.
I think that Senator Patterson talking about technology is that governments and companies should stop going to the annual Wuhan conference that China convenes. Like that's a first, because the CEOs level of Google and Microsoft and Cisco, they all attended. The second thing that everyone should stop attending is the Beijing Police Expo, which I don't know, this year was probably not held because of various reasons, but that expo is where they sell police equipment, riot control equipment, etc. And it's public, and the companies go and they also actually report afterwards all of the great contracts that they signed, for certain kinds of, even including like helicopters and surveillance equipment. And so that I think we haven't talked about, which is the role of the business sector, that I think that's also beginning to shift. But if you think about 2008, the Olympics, including law firms and PR firms and firms producing surveillance cameras, were all chomping at the bit for the contracts to represent the Beijing Olympic Committee to install the additional 100,000 of surveillance cameras. And what they basically did was leave China after the Olympics with a strengthened biometric technology surveillance system that was not just Beijing, but the other cities where things were held. So I think that is also important when you raise the point about technology, is that in China's 5-year plan, 2025 plan, Made in China plan, that technology to become the leader is.
Sorry, apologies.
So it is to invest. When you talk about investment in United Front and stability maintenance, we're talking about not just that. We're talking about investment in AI, quantum, big data storage centers, so that they're actually leading now in all of those areas. And I think that there needs to be some serious strategic thinking to not allow China to then now dominate in all of those technology frontiers.
Okay, one last very quick question before we wrap this up. Just maybe a one-word answer. Who does Xi Jinping or CCP in general, who do they want to win the US election? Who would be better for them, Trump or Biden?
It's Trump, because they know if they just tell him how smart he is, he'll do whatever you say.
Craig, James?
I would say Biden, I have to say. because Biden seems to me that he's only recently has come up with a more clear position about China. But Trump, it seems to me that he's quite tough. It takes a bully to know the bully in a way.
I'm going to cheat. I'm not going to enter into that. It's a dangerous game for an elected politician too. But what I will say
can't.
is that I visited Washington, D.C. last year as a guest of the US State Department, and I was astounded by the strength of the bipartisan concern about China, particularly in Congress. And that is a very good thing for the world, regardless of whoever's in the White House, that there is such strong unanimity in Congress.
That's right.
All right. Well, you can tell us later once this isn't live, and then we can secretly record it and release it to the media. With that, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming in for this very interesting session. And Brian, any closing?
Oh, I mean, look, at a personal level, thank you so much for joining this. It's something that's quite close to my heart, so I really appreciate it. And yes, thank you all.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great
Thank
to see
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.